There's a quote that is often attributed to Mark Twain. I don't know if he actually said it, but that a classic is a book everyone wants to have read, but no one actually wants to read, which is just brilliant, right? And it belies this hidden meaning about classics being important or um, that somehow we should read them, that they're part of our literary canon and important contributors to our culture, um, but they're not very accessible. They don't draw us in. They're not exciting. They're not as fun as some pulp novel that we might pick up in an airport and read on a rainy afternoon. So, what is it about a classic that makes it unapproachable? I mean, if it's a classic, shouldn't it speak to sort of universal human truths? Shouldn't it have some enduring characteristics that allow us to experience these stories from long ago? If it's unapproachable, how can it be a classic? Uh, I want to I want to ruminate on this and ask a couple of questions about this topic that I don't have great answers to, but I have some thoughts and I wanted to share them aloud. And to do that, I want to start with the archetype of challenging, inaccessible classics that people want to say they've read, but boy, is it hard to get through. And that would be Dante Alighieri's Divine Comedy. The Dante's Inferno is the first of three sections of this work. This is a poem that's written in rhyming triplicate in Italy in the medieval period in the 1400s. And um, it is one of the more uh, inaccessible, in my opinion, works in the sort of literary canon. I read it as an adult a few years ago. I had to read two or three companion pieces along with it to sort of be helped along the way by scholars who could make sense of the story in a way that let me understand it. I believe to more than just a passing extent as sort of thumbing through it. And I don't believe that it's just the age of that story that makes it challenging. In this story, the main protagonist, who's also named Dante, is a writer who lives in the contemporaneous Italy in the time that the author wrote the story. And he ends up going through hell, through purgatory, and to heaven. These are the three sort of parts of. There's a lot of symmetry, and that symmetry is sort of informed by a lot of contemporaneous religious sensibilities of symmetry being beautiful and reflecting the structure of a divinely created world. And he goes through these places and is given a tour of these places by his hero and the sort of most exalted writer in his world, which is Virgil. And Virgil lived, 1,000 years before Dante, and Virgil wrote a lot of poems, epic sagas, including the Aeneid, which he was probably most famous for, and that would be the big epic story that would be the one most sort of foregrounded for someone like Dante. And the Aeneid is much more readable. The Aeneid is much more accessible to a lay audience, and you can read it, and it's much more enjoyable. It's an adventure story. In fact, the Aeneid is functionally a retelling of an even earlier, 1,000 years before that, work from Homer, the paired works of the Iliad and the Odyssey. The Aeneid kind of takes from both. And the Odyssey is way more approachable, despite being thousands of years older than the Divine Comedy. So, how can it's not just the age? How can stories that are much older um, be so much closer to us personally, be so much more accessible, so much more fun to read and engaging and draw us in, and so much more relatable. Well, despite all of these stories, uh, Virgil is not writing a contemporaneous fictionalized story. Dante is writing a story that takes place in the time and place where he is. He's been exiled from Florence, where he lived, and there's a lot of political upheaval and a lot of real life drama that's very akin to sort of Game of Thrones, power plays between state actors and regency and religious figures. And a lot of the story is allegory of those characters and of those power plays. And I think one of the major differences between a story like Dante's, where he has these powerful houses and these powerful religious figures and these powerful state actors who are all vying for control over land and resources and populations, sounds fantastic. That sounds like a great story. I mean, this is how George R.R. Martin made his living, right? Is telling these stories of power plays between powerful family structures and powerful state structures and religious structures. But I think Dante is expecting his readership to have a, to him, contemporaneous and modern understanding of the situation. When you read through those stories, he will talk about the different groups, and it'll be like, oh, this pope is undergoing such and such a torture. Isn't that ironic? But he doesn't explain to you who that pope is and why that pope has found himself in the fiery or cold pits of hell. Or he talks about, these political actors versus these ones, the Guelphs versus the Ghibellines, and isn't it, crazy that they ended up like this? And Virgil kind of shows Dante, this is the situation with them, and then they move on. And they don't really walk you through who these characters are and why the situation they find themselves in is poignant. Because I think Dante is expecting his readership to understand that. It would be very prescient for him to write for an audience 1,000 years in the future, halfway around the globe. So I don't really fault him for that, but it certainly makes sense that a story written for a contemporaneous audience would be a challenge for us. But there certainly are stories written for contemporaneous audiences that are not challenges. Shakespeare, despite the language being tricky, most of the characters in Shakespeare, yeah, they carry swords, and probably not a lot of us walk around with swords. But most of the characters in Shakespeare they're just regular people who live in a city, and they wake up in the morning and they eat breakfast and then they go to work at a job. And it's a crazy story because it's the equivalent to a modern movie, but they're very approachable because they were written for a sort of lay audience without a lot of, for the most part, political layering, and not a lot of allegory to comment on, at least not to the level of Dante. So something like Shakespeare, which is similarly old, I find to be more approachable in a lot of instances. Read something like Much Ado About Nothing, which is just a fluffy comedy. It's hilarious. The jokes still land. The humor is still there. There's no part of it where you're like, I don't get it. This is so, I got to flip open some companion piece to whatever. It's some fanciful, Midsummer Night's Dream. Everyone loves that story. It's very approachable. So it isn't the age that makes it unapproachable. And to reiterate, or to find another example that might illustrate that more is a retelling of the Odyssey that's closer to us than the Aeneid, which is James Joyce's Ulysses. Now, here's a book that was written not exactly in our time, but very close enough that the lived experiences with people like James Joyce and modern contemporaneous readers would be very would be so similar that we shouldn't find a lot of difference uh, between our sort of zeitgeist, between our political and religious sensibilities, between how we view the world. Um, but Joyce's retelling of Ulysses, which is he took the Odyssey and he rewrote it. Boy, is that thing opaque. He tells the story of the Odyssey in a fictionalized contemporaneous setting to him, um, and recapitulates the development of the English language as an allegory of a human being born and developing alongside the story of Ulysses as he goes through this. So there is layer upon layer upon layer that is just stacked so thick, it is very inaccessible. It is a huge challenge to read. I mean, you can read through it. It's not like the vocabulary is difficult or opaque, or the grammar makes it difficult. You can read through it and understand it at some level. And then you can read through it and understand it at a deeper level. And then you can read someone's, PhD thesis on it and understand it at another level. And you can keep rereading it and finding more and more stuff about it and realize that there is a lot going on that isn't accessible on the surface. The original Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, is just an action flick. It's like watching Errol Flynn as Robin Hood or watching Johnny Depp as Jack Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean. It really is no different. I mean, it's swashbuckling sword fights with crazy monsters in an effort to go on some quest and come home. The last scene in the Odyssey when Odysseus goes on this huge voyage and fights all these monsters and stuff, and it's fantastic fun the whole way. And he comes home and he finds all of these sort of suitors are trying to woo his wife, and they're in his house, and he's dressed in disguise. He's disguised himself as a beggar, and there's this scene at the end where he sort of throws off his beggar cloak and reveals himself to be the hero, and jumps up on the dining room table and like sword fights with these other heroic sort of action figure type characters, and it is just a straight up Jack Sparrow sword fight. It is Robin Hood. It is all of the swashbuckling stories that we've sort of imagined when we were young boys and girls playing with sticks out in the backyard. It's every bit as accessible as reading an adventure novel now, in my opinion. Depending on some of the translations are a little wonky because they were translated like 200 years ago, so they're translated into a version of English that isn't easy. But if you read a relatively modern translation, it's pretty accessible. So I don't have a central thesis of this. I just wanted to illustrate some differences and highlight some examples of canon literature that are, as Mark Twain puts it, books that no one wants to read, and why they don't want to read them, why they are inaccessible, and compare those to some that are very accessible. There are tons of stories throughout history that are quite funny. There are ancient Greek plays and poems that are just comedies that are meant to be sort of lighthearted, that were written for a contemporaneous audience, but they were sort of throwaway comedies to just be done as live plays in the season they were written and then move on. And just like Shakespeare's comedies, the humor lands, right? It's the same jokes as we would tell in modern movies, and because there's not these presumptions of deep political readings of contemporaneous power plays and political figures and religious figures, they seem just as approachable as most modern stories. So I don't know that I entirely agree with the quote about classics are something that everyone wants to read, but no one actually wants to read. That certainly is the case for a lot of them, but it has just inspired a bit of reflection on my point about what it means for a work of literature to both be a classic, to sort of speak to universal human truths, to be durable throughout time, and to be able to be understood by an audience far into the future, and to be difficult to approach. What it means for a story to be easy for an audience to enjoy and to be drawn in versus a story that is more demanding and has higher expectations of an audience, and expectations that become more and more difficult to fulfill the farther in time and space from that author as we go. And, that lens has informed a lot of my opinion about some modern works, and I think explains a bit about, why some of the more recent books seem to last and some of them don't. We can look at something like Harry Potter, we can look at something like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, and we can say, these books were written a century apart. Are they both going to last? Will one of them last and one of them not? Look at, James Patterson and Stephen King books and say, are these going to last? Do these require some sort of current knowledge? Look at a Tom Clancy book. Is that going to be relevant and fun to read in hundreds of years? Apply the same sort of metrics. If we're relying on a contemporaneous reader to understand some of the political nuance of state actors and secret spy agencies in our current conditions, those might not be the kind of stories that last forever. Harry Potter might, because Hogwarts was made up so it was explained to the readers. If you're reading Patriot Game, by Tom Clancy, you're sort of expected to know the global hegemony and the power structures that are the backdrop to that story. Anyway, if you have thoughts on this topic, please, I always love to hear them. Add them in the comments, or make a video of your own, and I will happily watch it. Because the more we have these conversations, the more we can all enjoy this kind of fiction. So, thank you guys very much.